Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Dalia Simangan, Associate Professor at Hiroshima University, and welcome to this online seminar on the United Nations 75th Anniversary Declaration and the Sustainable Development Goals. This seminar is organized by the Global Peacebuilding Association of Japan in cooperation with the Association of Former International Civil Servants, or AFIX Japan, the Academic Council on the United Nations System, or ACON's Tokyo office, and the Kyoto Peacebuilding Center, or KPC. Let me remind everyone to kindly turn off or mute your microphones when you're not talking to avoid interruptions to our speakers. I also want to inform you that this seminar is being recorded and will be publicized through the association's websites. And after this seminar, the speakers will send a written summary of their talk or comments, which will form the written report summarizing what transpired during the seminar. This will also be published in the association's websites. I have already noted from the registration those who wish to be anonymous from these documentations. I'm also acting as the timekeeper for the seminar. Our keynote speaker will have 15 minutes and then the commentators will have 10 minutes each, giving us the remaining time for questions. It would be very helpful if we keep this time limit so we have ample time for open discussion, because I'm sure our participants have questions about this timely and very important topic. And to save time, I will introduce our speakers briefly, and I invite you to read their more detailed bios in the program. We are very fortunate that our distinguished speaker and commentators are so generous of their time to share their insights and experience with us today. To kick off the seminar, I'm honored to request Mr. Yasushi Akashi to make a brief introductory remarks. Mr. Akashi, as many of us know, served as the UN Undersecretary General for Disarmament, Humanitarian Affairs, and Public Information at the headquarters, and the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia. He's now the Special Advisor of both the GPAJ and AFIX Japan. Over to you, Mr. Akashi.
Thank you very much. I hope my microphone is on now. I'm very much looking forward to listening to the presentation by my very good friend, Professor Yuge Akiko, and also afterwards listening to three commentators. I have been asked by Mr. Hasegawa as well as by Mrs. Yuge to make some opening remarks. As you all know, United Nations will be having its 75th anniversary from its establishment or creation next year. But in comparison with the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN, United Nations by next year will have almost 4 times as long a life as its predecessor, League of Nations. Of course, just to live long is not the purpose of an international organization. But the first 45 years of the life of the United Nations was a period of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that was a period of much difficulty for the UN, which did not function as it was planned. But in those 45 years, UN did quite a few things. For instance, it somehow managed to end the brutal Korean War in 1950. And then in the Middle East, it achieved several ceasefires and withdrawals of troops, thus ensuring some uneasy peace or truce in the Middle East. Besides, several other things were done in those 45 years. And after the end of the Cold War, somehow many people, many organizations and governments felt that the time finally came for the revival of the United Nations itself. And in the 1990s, at least for the first 5 years, UN did achieve quite a few things in Cambodia, in Africa, and also in Latin America. But the next 5 years of the 90s was a very difficult, challenging period for the UN. So there was ups and downs in those 10-year period. But at the end, more than 100 new countries decided to join the United Nations as new members. And as the number of new developing countries grew, the problem of the development became as important an objective of the United Nations as war and peace is. And especially in the 1970s, I recall, centering in 1975, the North-South issues of development became paramount as the most divisive issue for the United Nations. And and today, instead of many past issues, we have Myanmar in Asia and Afghanistan in Central Asia as two foremost issues for the entire world today. So United Nations has always been something we all look forward to, or something about which we commiserate with each other about the lack of progress towards peace. And now, United Nations is something to look forward, but something about which we despair of or criticize harshly. Also, this is a period of SDGs. The Sustainable Development Decades of 15 years. We are just in its middle. And SDGs expect a lot out of governments, but more so from the businesses or enterprises, from workers, non-governmental entities, and all segments of society to change their basic behavior and to be aware that we are producers and consumers at the same time. And the most important issues we confront is the question of division or cleavage in the level of development and wealth. In those 75 years, or 74 years to be exact, of the life of the UN, I particularly recall the time when Japan finally became 80th member of the United Nations. That was 1956, December. I remember also another date, which is 1971, October, when a new government of China, created by a communist revolution, finally took the place of Taiwan. I exactly remember the moment of great excitement in the General Assembly Hall. So this is just to show you an example that United Nations, we look forward for its change and evolution, but it does not seem to move as fast as we expect. But when we do not expect for it to move forward, nevertheless, it continues to move. So the evolution of the UN is very uneven and unpredictable. So in conclusion, we hope that war will be replaced eventually by peace. Opposition or conflict will be replaced by friendship and cooperation, and that despair will finally be replaced by big, bright hope. At least I believe that these changes occur, sometimes unexpectedly. It takes time. It requires great patience and persistence on our part. But at any rate, I think it's better to have the United Nations than not having it at all. It is better to have it, in my opinion, and that's the basis of my thinking and my behavior. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akashi, for that wonderful message of hope. Thank you so much. Now, our keynote speaker for this seminar is a professor at the Department of Global Politics at the Faculty of Law of Hosei University. And she has a distinguished career in the UN, having served as the director of UNDP Representation Office in Tokyo and special advisor to the UNDP administrator, among many other positions. Let's all welcome Professor Akiko Yuge. Over to you, Professor Yuge.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Dalia, and good evening, everybody, and maybe good morning and good afternoon to those of you who may be in a different time zone. I would like to thank the co-organizers, the 4 co-organizers, for inviting me to be a speaker at this seminar. So I will share some slides in making my presentation, so please give me a moment to share my slides, okay? Let me do that now. Okay, and I will put this in a slideshow, so please give me a moment. So I just want to check, can you see my slides and can you hear me?
Yes, Professor Yuge.
Yeah, it's okay, yeah, okay. So let me start my presentation. So this is the title page, and let me move to the next page. Okay, so this is the outline of my presentation. I will first talk about the 2 major key events for the UN 75th anniversary, the global consultation and the declaration. And then I will talk about the UN Secretary General's report, our common agenda, which was the follow-up to the declaration. And then I will share some observations in moving forward. So among the series of events that took place during 2020, the 75th anniversary year, I will talk about 2 things. And one is this global consultation called the UN 75 Initiative. In January 2020, the UN Secretary General launched a global consultation. It's a year-long consultation to mark the anniversary. And through surveys and dialogues, more than 1.5 million people from all the member states participated, and then they share their opinions. So to look at the results of this consultation, of course, there were some differences in results depending on the region and human development levels, but these are the key ones. The top immediate priority was universal access to healthcare. And other short-term high priorities included more investment in education and youth programs, as well as access to safe water and sanitation. For longer term priorities, the top one was more environmental protection, and others included employment opportunities, more respect for human rights, and reducing conflict. And to address the global challenges, 97% of the respondents believe that international cooperation is important and that they looked to the UN to lead in international cooperation to address the global challenges. At the same time, many respondents also wanted the UN to innovate, to be more inclusive, more engaged, accountable, and effective. So the second key result of the 75th anniversary was the declaration itself, the declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the UN, which was adopted at the UN General Assembly in September last year. And this is what the declaration stated. Our challenges are interconnected and can only be addressed through reinvigorated multilateralism, and that multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity. There is no other global organization with the legitimacy, convening power, and normative impact of the United Nations, and that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is our roadmap and its implementation a necessity for our survival. At the same time, the UN 75th Declaration included 12 commitments. I'm not going to read each one of the commitments, but please take a look at this slide because I listed all of them. So here are the 12. And as you can note, most commitments cover the areas contained in the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And what I did is I underlined 4 commitments, namely number 6, number 7, number 11, and number 12, because I felt that these 4 gave added emphasis compared to how they are stated and treated in the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And I will come back to this when I talk about our common agenda. So in adopting the declaration, which included these 12 commitments, member states requested the Secretary General to report back with recommendations to advance our common agenda and to respond to current and future challenges. So accordingly, the SG carried out extensive consultations with member states, thought leaders, young people, civil society, local governments, parliamentarians, and the UN system agencies and its many partners. And as a result, he put together this report titled Our Common Agenda, which was released on the 10th of September, which means 3 weeks ago. So in the report, the SG contrasts 2 possible futures. One is a world heading towards breakdown and perpetual crisis, and the other one is a more positive outlook based on solidarity and cooperation. And he stated that humanity faces a stark and urgent choice, breakdown or breakthrough. And the report emphasizes that the need for solidarity, trust, and cooperation is very, very important. The report further states that in this time of division, fracture, and mistrust, the UN is needed more than ever. And our common agenda is an agenda of action designed to accelerate the implementation of multilateral agreements and cooperation, particularly the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. So this report contains 90 specific recommendations that are grouped under 4 broad areas. And the recommendations under each broad area are interlinked with those under other broad areas, naturally. As the report is 85 pages and contains much information, in my limited time of presentation, I will have to confine myself to only some of the recommendations, so please understand that. In terms of the first one, the first broad area titled Renewable of Social Contract, anchored in human rights to rebuild trust and social cohesion. These are some of the recommendations among many. Achieve universal social protection coverage, including universal health care, education, housing, decent work and income protection, and there's a recommendation to hold the World Social Summit in 2025. Next point is eradicate violence against women and girls and ensure their full and equal participation. On finance, address tax evasion, money laundering, and illicit financial flows, and to also correct the blind spots in how we measure progress and prosperity by including measures that complement GDP, and also tackle the infodemic of misinformation plaguing the world and introduce a global code of conduct that promotes integrity in public information. In broad area number 2, which is titled Focus on the Future through a deepening of solidarity with the world's young people and future generations, the recommendations include transform education, skills training, and lifelong learning, and convene a Transforming Education Summit in 2022, promote long-term intergenerational thinking and equity, and establish Futures Lab to conduct forecasting and future impact assessments of policy decisions, appoint the Special Envoy for Future Generations, establish a UN Youth Office, repurpose the UN Trusteeship Council into a future-oriented body, agree on a declaration on future generations. On broad area 3, titled Urgent Action to Protect and Deliver Our Global Commons and Global Public Goods. Recommendations included to immediately establish a global vaccination plan for COVID-19, establish an emergency platform to be triggered in response to large-scale crisis to better prepare for future global shocks, hold a biennial summit of heads of state and government between the members of G20 and the members of ECOSOC, the Secretary General and the heads of IFIs to work towards a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient global economy, to convene a summit of the future in 2023 to forge a new global consensus on the most critical concerns that the international system must protect and deliver, and also establish a high-level advisory board led by former heads of state and or government to inform the summit of the future and advance governance in the areas of greatest concern. Broad area 4, the title is an upgraded UN that is fit for a new era, UN 2.0. And recommendations included, among others, transformation driven by data, digital innovation, strategic foresight, performance and results orientation, strengthen the UN as a source of reliable data and evidence, re-establish the SDGs Scientific Advisory Board, create an advisory group on local and regional governments, strengthen collaboration with civil society organizations and the private sector. You may feel that this list of broad area 4 is short, but there are other recommendations on UN reform that are included under the other broad areas. So in order to do all these things, multilateralism is an issue. So there has to be more inclusive, more networked, more effective, and more equitable and representative multilateralism. And the more inclusive multilateralism means that in addition to states and international organizations, many more non-state actors, including the ones listed there, like civil society, academic and social scientific institutions, foundations, the private sector, parliaments, cities and local governments, communities, regional bodies, etc., must be part of multilateralism. And the rich knowledge and expertise and experience and capacities of these diverse actors must be drawn more systematically in tackling the global issues. And I want to also mention that there should be a stronger voice for developing countries. A more networked multilateralism is going beyond the traditional silos, and national, regional, global actors must enhance cooperation through additional networking, and such networks can be open, flexible, and dynamic, allowing for variable participation by a wide range of actors. A more effective multilateralism is the one that delivers on its promises, and all actors must be held accountable for commitments made, and a balance is needed between those that are voluntary and those that are binding in terms of actions, depending on the challenges we face. And I added one more to the SDGs list, which is more equitable, representative, and legitimate multilateralism reflecting the global situation. Then in this last part, I listed some of my observations in moving forward. So the first point is that the SG responded to the members' request and presented this report, and then that he took a consultative process involving many stakeholders to prepare it. And this report covers a broad range and contains many useful recommendations. So it should serve as a launch pad for action and a pathway to a better world. There's been overall positive reaction by member states, global leaders, think tanks, and other organizations. Many praised as a landmark report, comprehensive, ambitious but necessary, visionary and forward-looking with long-term perspective, and innovative. Some civil society organizations wanted more in the UN reform, such as the appointment of a civil society envoy. Number 5, delivering on these ambitions may be the most challenging part. Considerable work is still needed to translate many of the recommendations into concrete actions, and ambitious transformative actions are needed. My list continues. Number 6, examine, map out, and sequence the 90 recommendations based on urgency and complexity, and agree on a time frame for implementation. And number 7 is implementation is most critical. Member states must immediately start the intergovernmental process to implement the recommendations. And this must be an inclusive, multi-stakeholder process. Political will and leadership of member states are crucial. At the same time, the UN system and its agencies must immediately implement recommendations that can be materialized within their authority. Number 8, the proposed summit meetings are important as they enable focused discussion on specific topics and forge global agreements. They also provide a target year for deciding on specific themes. Now it's not the time to complain and criticize what was not included. As the report states, now is the time to take the next steps in our journey together in solidarity with and for all people. That's number 9. Number 10 is our common agenda reinforces the need for robust action on the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And my last point is periodic monitoring is needed on the progress of implementation. So thank you for listening. And that's all I can say in the time allocated to me. And I think it's just exactly 15 minutes. Thank you very much. And I will stop showing these slides.
Thank you very much, Professor Yuge, and for really keeping track of the time. It's actually under 15 minutes, so thank you so much for that. And despite being under 15 minutes, you were able to provide us an overview and your observations of our common agenda and how it can reinvigorate inclusive, networked, and effective multilateralism. Thank you for that, Professor Yuge. Now we'll move on to our commentators. Our first commentator has more than 25 years of experience at the United Nations, promoting sustainable human development in various countries. Let's welcome the current UNDP resident representative in Indonesia, Mr. Norimasa Shimomura. Over to you, Mr. Shimomura.
Thank you, Dahlia, and greetings to everyone from Jakarta. I don't have a nice PowerPoint presentation, but let me pick up from one of the pointers Professor Yuge raised. Namely the 4th priority or broad priority area of the UN Secretary General's our common agenda. This is about a UN 2.0 that is fit for purpose. This reminds me of US President Biden's recent speech at the General Assembly, that the force of arms cannot win a battle against COVID, which I also interpreted to imply that military cannot solve issues like climate crisis, or even succeed in building a lasting democracy in a country like Afghanistan. Multilateralism is key, and the United Nations is at the heart of it. The big question is whether the UN is fit for purpose, as we now see UN 100 in the horizon. So it was an excellent foresight on the part of the UN Secretary General when he embarked on a 3-track UN reform soon after he took on his post 5 years ago, a reform that looked at UN's political system, development system, and management. And in the next few minutes, I'd like to share my personal views on the reform of the UN's development system, especially at the country level. The current UN development system reform has been quite far-reaching in the history of the United Nations, ranging from changes that are within SG's own prerogative to changes that really required member states' endorsement through a landmark GA Resolution 72-279, among many other things. Simply put, the overall objective of the reform has been to turn the operational arm of the United Nations to be more efficient, effective, and accountable to the host countries and member states, making sure that the UN can effectively support the effort to achieve the SDGs in ways that leave no one behind. The United Nations Development System reform has several priorities at global level, regional level, and country level. At the country level, there's been a series of efforts to create a new generation of UN country teams under empowered UN resident coordinator. This involved the introduction of new UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, which is an acronym UN SDCF, which replaced, many of you may remember, the previous UNDAF, UNDAF, the United Nations Development Assistance Framework, as a single most important instrument that brings together the UN agencies on the ground and aligns their support behind the SDGs and host country priorities that are also in line with the principles of the UN Charter. Country level reform also involved delinking of the UN resident coordinators from UNDP resident representatives. And you might recall that before, these two posts were assumed by a single person, managed by UNDP. Now, the UN resident coordinator is a staff of the UN Secretariat, dedicated to spearhead UN coordination effort on the ground. Although I was going to briefly explain the reforms at the regional and global levels, let me just skip them in the interest of time. So the country level reform of the UN development system involves a very large number of pieces all over the world, which implies that it is a process that can only be achieved over time with changes in the culture of the way UN agencies work together. After the reform was launched in January 2019, the Office of Internal Oversight Services, or OIOS, conducted an early review of the UN Resident Coordinator System reform last year. Overall findings were positive. And today I just wanted to share how I personally see the progress. Some consistent, obviously, with the findings of the above corporate review. But before sharing my views, I'd like to point out that the level of progresses could vary from one country to another, with personalities and chemistries playing a big part. So how's the reform going at the country level? I definitely see that a positive mind shift is happening among the UN country team members, dedicating more of the agency resources to make coordination happen more genuinely. An excellent example is how the UN collaborated to respond to the current COVID pandemic, starting from emergency health response, humanitarian response, to response against socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. I'm also hoping to hear more about good coordination examples from other commentators later today. Also, the new UNDAF, or the UN SDCF, has aligned the UN's minimum coordination standard to perhaps what was at the level of best practices in the past. The other way to look at this is that the old UNDAF probably had almost everything that's demanded of the new UN SDCF. What was not there was a broad-based commitment from across the UN to make it work fully. So there's been a genuine progress, but mostly qualitative in nature. Quantitative progress, for example, in savings generated from the operational cost of the UN, has not been so easy to account for than it sounds like. Because any savings in, let's say, 20 or so UN agencies operating at the country level, which I'm sure generates savings, cannot be pooled and shown altogether. Instead, those savings are reprogrammed internally by each UN agency. So the overall saving result is not as visible and easy to grasp as one may wish. I have the feeling the UN system could not explain this well enough at the beginning of the reform and created some false expectations among the member states. Delinking UN resident coordinator from UNDP resident representative brought much needed clarity and assurance about the independence of the resident coordinator. UN resident coordinator is now meant to have access to the highest national authority, and they do in many countries. But where this does not happen, the resident coordinator's representational status may not be so different from other heads of UN agencies, including UNDP resident representative, while resident coordinator, no longer being UNDP resident representative, no longer has direct control of individual programmatic activities, staff, and budget. On the other hand, UNDP, if I may use this word, UNDP has been liberated from the obligation to manage the UN coordination system and to act on behalf of the UN country team, sometimes at the cost of UNDP's own interest, without much appreciation from all sides. UNDP can now go far deeper into its substantive policy mandates. And nonetheless, in some countries, UNDP res reps has lost access to the highest authorities of the host country, perhaps making it harder to deliver policy impact at the highest level of the host country. So I feel the success of the country level reform depends to a good extent on how the UN resident coordinator and UNDP resident representative work together. Also, unlike how it was initially envisaged, I think UN resident coordinator hasn't really become the boss of all UN country team members, but remains an empowered leader. And the UN Secretary General told us a couple of years ago that a leader can exist so long as there is a team member who is willing to follow the leader. Before, the UN resident coordinator did not have to charm UNDP of all the agencies when it was also the boss of UNDP. But now, with the delinking, UN resident coordinator has one more big agency to charm and cajole in the UN country team. Now, finally, I'd like to point out that just like UN is not a single supra government, UN country team is not a single management entity. This is more evident at the headquarters level, where the executive heads of many UN specialized agencies do not have reporting lines to the UN Secretary General to start with. This has its own advantages, just as each UN agency has become the top expert body in their own complex areas of work. But it does pose a challenge against us in offering coherent policy advice under a single leadership. I believe the current UN development system reform contains all necessary pieces to make this happen. But since it takes some time for the dust to settle, as they say, it's important that the member states and UN entities keep focused on implementing and also calibrating this reform in the next few years with the patience and persistence, as Mr. Akashi put it at the beginning of today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Narimasa, for posing that question for us to think about maybe later on how to make the UN fit for purpose and how this question informs the reform of UN development system. Thank you, Mr. Narimasa. Now, our second commentator has 27 years of experience in international development and has also worked in many countries at different capacities, and most recently as the UN Resident Coordinator in Guyana. It's a pleasure to introduce to all of you Ms. Mikiko Tanaka. Over to you, Ms. Tanaka.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Pleasure to be with you. Yuge-san, Akashi-san, and Shimomura-san, they've given a wonderful introduction. So I want to dig in actually on this, how to deliver, how the UN delivers as one to meet the ambitions of this 2030 agenda and the UN 75. So I wanted to give an example of a program called the Spotlight Initiative. It's the largest global program that tackles SDG 5, gender equality, and particularly in that, violence against women and girls. And it is funded by the European Union, $500 million. It's a global program, as I said. And Guyana, where I served as our resident coordinator, was one of the countries. Okay, let me see if I can share this now. Okay, so this is where Guyana is. It's at the north of South America. It's the only English-speaking country in South America, but historically and culturally, it's very close to the Caribbean. It's a small population, less than 1 million. It's very diverse, but it's got the highest intimate partner violence prevalence in Latin America and the Caribbean. So let me just move. So the Spotlight Initiative, it has a global framework, and what I wanted to emphasize was the design of this program is very much aligned to the UN Development System reform. And so it tackles this issue of gender-based violence, violence against women and girls through these 6 angles. Innovation probably would be in the prevention and also women's movements. And we have to tailor that, of course, to every country where the program runs. So in that, and this is where the crossover with this, UN Development System reform at the country level that Shimomura-san just explained overlaps. So, and this is my own take as RC. There's much clearer roles and accountability for results between the RC, the implementing UN agencies. There were 4 in Guyana, and the program coordination team that was in the resident coordinator's office. There was a very strong quality assurance and system coherence also brought at the headquarters level by a Spotlight Secretariat under the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. There was an extremely strong emphasis on partnerships for advocacy, because this required behavior change, attitudinal change, change in norms and values to stop gender-based violence. And this was across the UN, with the EU, the national government, civil society, private sector, etc. And integrated approach. You all already saw those 6 pillars in the Spotlight design. It's multiple SDGs. It requires integration within the Spotlight initiative, but also with other initiatives going in the country related to gender-based violence. Leave no one behind, of course, is at the core of the objective of the Spotlight initiative. Victims and survivors of violence, and also the men and boys who also are quite marginalized and become perpetrators of violence as well. It's also about grounding policies and laws and services to the reality of those that are left behind. And this is where I think we really saw through the Spotlight initiative the gap between policy, laws, services, and what the people need. And also changing the ways of business of the UN. So including things like operational, procedures. The UN is not really the most, efficient or the fastest or the accessible from, the other like civil society organizations who try to get funding. So we also try to change that as well. Just to show some pictures of the beautiful nature there. And I see this little thing at the top. So one of the things that really, I think, helped to bring the stakeholders, the UN system together, and also the other partners, the government, of course, the EU, the communities, the civil society together, was really going out to the field. And so we did field missions together jointly with all the partners to these communities to talk about gender-based violence. Can you maybe go to the next slide? Yeah, so just to show, we had 4 agencies working in the Spotlight initiative. It was UNFPA, UNICEF, UNDP, and UN Women. And we had the government counterpart, and we would go into the communities together. The EU would also join us too. And here is where we really face the reality of, how difficult it is to stop gender-based violence, violence against women and girls. And I think the conversations that we had with the community members, for instance, this was an indigenous community. Indigenous peoples are minority in Guyana, and they really feel they are not just left out, but discriminated against from the governments and the majority population groups that are on the coastland of the country. And so they felt that in the meeting that they were under attack, the culture was under attack. Some men were denying that there was gender-based violence. We were talking about incest as well, which is very high in these areas, and they were denying that. But I think what happened in the conversations was, as everybody spoke, so for instance, the EU ambassador would say that gender-based violence is actually a global phenomenon. I would also reinforce that by talking about the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals is a UN General Assembly resolution. It's for all the member states. It's multicultural, multi-country. So it's not targeting this community or this ethnic group. Then you would have the government coming in explaining about the government policy. The UN agencies in their various expertise and role would also explain what the issues are, what's the bottom line. Basically, it's zero tolerance against violence and incest and etc. So that actually really helped to pull the team together, the UN team together, to tackle these questions, challenges that were being thrown at us, and also to in a way bond together with the government and civil society organizations as we tackle these challenges together. So and yeah, as I said, some of these communities are very, difficult to go out to. We talked to the police in this community, also a very hardship duty station for them. So we kind of understood, what the challenges are of the services of the government in trying to prevent and also to prosecute, to investigate incidences of violence. Okay, so we can stop the slides. So yeah, one more minute. So I think, look, as Shimomura-san said, the system has changed for the better, but it is up to the country teams, resident coordinators, people on the ground to make the most out of it. And I do think that there is an enabling environment. However, really tackling the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, really to the core, changing values that discriminate people, leave people behind, that really requires changing of minds. The transformation is really the difficult part, like Yuge-san said in the UN 75 summary. That's the most difficult part, but we do need to have that, unity and the solidarity of the team of the UN with the others, to create that movement. And I think, I think the environment is certainly a better one in order to deliver that. That's my own personal take. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. Sorry for the mess up in the presentation piece.
So much for sharing those wonderful pictures and also for giving us some concrete examples on the ground with regard to implementing the SDGs, especially SDG 5 and SDG 17. So thank you for that, Ms. Tanaka. Completing this really impressive record of careers at the UN by our esteemed panelists is our third commentator, who also has an illustrious career at the UN for 34 years, including the ECOSOC, UNDESA, and UNCRD, among others. She now teaches at various universities and is currently a member of the Executive Committee of AFEX Japan. Let's all welcome Ms. Chikako Takase. Over to you, Ms. Takase.
Thank you so much, Dalia. And thank you for all the speakers so far. I learned a lot from your presentations. I just wanted to go back a little bit because the theme of today is United Nations 75th anniversary and the SDGs. So I just wanted to put a little bit focus on SDGs. And so I wanted to make a point that the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development really made sort of difference in how the UN work on development. As we all know, for SDGs, we are all involved. It is for everybody, and everybody has to work. But probably previously, it was more one direction system that developed countries supporting the developing countries. And so there is a remarkable difference between MDGs and SDGs. People just think that maybe because the name is so similar, SDGs just took over MDGs, but there is a clear difference and departure in the way we treat the development. And so we are now finally, for somebody who was working with sustainable development for since quite the very beginning, finally, it's so pleasing to see that the sustainable development became the framework of the development agenda. And then, so it is very encouraging to see the declaration also keep this momentum and saying that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is our roadmap, and its implementation a necessity for our survival. And guided by the purposes and the principles of the Charter, we are here to ensure the future we want, the United Nations we need. And this term, the future we want, is actually the outcome document of the Rio Plus 20 that decided to develop sustainable development. And somehow they use twice this term in the declaration. So I feel the sentiment towards sustainable development in this declaration. In our common agenda, as Yuge-san noted, also states that this is an agenda for action designed to accelerate the implementation of existing agreements, including the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's very much in line with the Sustainable Development Agenda. And also, I would like to say that Mr. Guterres, the current SG, is very much proponent of the SDGs. He thinks that, he says his reforms based on sustainable sort of the SDGs to implement better. And so he's reforming the UN to implement better. Of course, it's going beyond that, but I think the starting point was that. And so he reformed the political areas, the peacekeeping field support, because SDGs include SDG 16, which is for peace and justice. And then as Shimomura-san went over very thoroughly on how the reforms are going in the countries, but it was also to bring the RC system under his direct supervision is also to better implement the SDGs. And I'm happy to hear that it's working well, but perhaps I would like to hear more from perhaps Mikiko-san, how this system that now you are RC and working for the secretariat, how that make the difference. Shimomura-san already shared his view on how this departure from the RC and he's working better in the as a UNDP rep. So perhaps I would like to hear that point from Mikiko-san. And the just a small point that this RC reform actually brought some difference in the secretariat staff as well. Now that with this bringing this RC system and the secretariat, I realized that the secretariat staff has more opportunity to go on field because the RC office is now under secretariat. So it's like a move within the secretariat. And I think it's a good thing because UN have this rotational system, and we work with this conference and so on, and to actually engage in the implementation in the country is, I think it's a very exciting thing for the staff members. And there are so many recommendations, as Yuge-san pointed out, in our common agenda, but there are many of them actually sort of basing on the sustainable development. Notably, this focus on future generations. Sustainable development is actually an intergenerational concept to begin with. And this over 30 years ago, in our common future, that's the report of the Commission on World Commission on Environment and Development. That's the document introduced and defined the concept of sustainable development. And it's defined as the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own. So to begin with, sustainable development is a very intergenerational concept, and I think it's a great effort of the SG to give the space and for the youth to actually work by setting up a new office and also appointing a special envoy for future generations. Also, he's reaching out for non-governmental stakeholders, and that's also very much concept of the sustainable development. And in Agenda 21, which is the outcome document of the first Rio conference, it has a large section on major group. They are called major group under sustainable development. They define 9 groups of those non-governmental actors. And of course, women are there, the youth are there, the local governments are there. And so it's really very much in line with the sustainable development. And also this local government is something that he's setting up advisory group on local and regional governments. And this is also, I wanted to note that this is the very reason that we have SDG 11, the fact that already more than half of the world population is in urban areas. And if the cities are not sustainable, then we will not have sustainable as a world as a whole. So I'm really glad that the SG is reaching out with the local and regional government. And that's also reflecting my last position that I had in Nagoya, the Center for Regional Development. I engaged a lot with the local and regional government. My last point is that, he has recommendations, many recommendations, and it was very wise of him to keep it as recommendations and let the member states to deliberate on them. And so we will wait for the resolution that will come out in the current GA to see how things are going. Of course, certain things he can do on his own, but many of the things we have to wait until the resolution comes out. So I'm looking forward to see what sort of resolution we have on this agenda in the current GA. So I keep it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Takase. Despite the many challenges that we are witnessing right now, it's really encouraging to hear from you, who has worked extensively for sustainable development, that we are continuing on the right direction when it comes to sustainable development for all and by all at present and in the future. So thank you for your service, Ms. Takase, and for sharing your insights with us. Now, to initiate and moderate our discussion, I'd like to invite the president of GPAJ, Professor Sukehiro Hasegawa.
Fine. I think we have many people who would like to speak. Before they can raise their hands or signal to me, may I just ask you, Tanaka-san, to respond to what Takase-san was asking you, if you can. That is RC's leadership
Sure.
tasks, carried out on the ground.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I know Shimomura-san also had that experience, but my first 2 years, I actually just finished my RC in Guyana in August. But the first 2 years, I was also the UNDP Res Rep, and then became full-time from 2019. Personally, it was really liberating, actually, in the sense that, you know, I didn't have that mix up anymore, right? Like I didn't have to think about what the other agencies are going to think about if I take a stance with UNDP, for instance. I could be really kind of neutral and independent, number one. Number two, actually the time liberation in terms of the operational programmatic responsibilities of managing the UNDP program, that going out actually liberated a lot of time to focus on those, you know, the convening power issues or really bringing the team together. So that was also quite liberating for me. I think in terms of, the dynamics, certainly as a whole, the UN country team as a whole, I think it was easier in the sense that, you know, it was a systemic change. So at headquarters level, regional level, similar movements were going on. The Secretary General was really pulling the system together. So, you know, I think, you know, even if there were always differences in opinion of what should happen on the country level, or, you know, I mean, the human dynamics can sometimes be problematic, but nonetheless, at least there was no, you know, real difference in what the vision was or what the roles were. So that made life a little bit easier. I think the other one that I would mention, apart from, you know, the benefits I saw in the Spotlight Initiative, which was a really, I think, smartly designed program. But vis-a-vis the government, I was just, you know, kind of thinking about what Shimomura-san said about, you know, having access to the top. You know, I mean, I didn't have a lot of access to the top was very busy all the time, right? So, but also you know, in the case of Guyana, the action happens below, you know, at the ministerial levels and even below it. So, you know, the advantage of the UN country team is that you have many entry points. And, you know, the stronger the UN country team is with their relationships with the individual ministries, that really, you know, positions the UN as a, you know, kind of a development assistance provider at the highest level, because you can actually have a kind of whole of government approach. And I think that the government did want to have that whole of government approach. And so that UN reform and that clearer architecture of, you know, who is where and who interacts with what, I think that helped. So I think those are the positives I would draw.
Okay, thanks so much. I think that would be a good guide. So may I now open the floor to anybody who would like to say, can you raise your hand? We have, of course, Ambassador Yanagisawa just come back from Malawi. Would you like to say a few words on this or ask questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Hasegawa-san. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, good afternoon and good day for everyone. And I'm so happy to see the faces of my old friends and colleagues. And I'm very encouraged. I was very encouraged to see that they are doing good jobs. And all speeches are very informative and I learned a lot. And as I was staying in Malawi, I was witnessing this change, like delinking the RC from RR, as well as that I witnessed the same initiative as Spotlight initiative in Malawi. But my feeling was that discussions on the UN reform or the consultation or whatever are happening in New York, even with the member states or NGOs or whatever, but those discussions are happening in New York, but not as much in the field. And in my experience, there was so much confusion in the delinking the RC and RR. So the government didn't understand what is happening. And so my question is how those reforms are accepted in the field by each government and at the field level. Of course, the UN country teams are trying hard to coordinate among each other, but what is the relationship vis-a-vis the government? That's my question. And my second question is very simple. How many Japanese RCs are there currently? Because my understanding is that we have very few Japanese RCs in the world. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Maybe we can have one or two other questions. If not, I think we can answer to this question. I think again, Tanaka-san and Shimomura-san, you're on the field. Maybe you can just comment to this question. How is it accepted by the government? And how many RCs are there? Tanaka-san and who else?
Yeah, that second question is, I finished. I was the only one in August, and I ended. So now it's 0, I think.
Oh,
yeah.
That's very
yeah. Shimomura-san, you want to start?
Okay, yeah, I think it's 0 too. I was second last, right? Before you. So, and Shoko-san in India, UNDP Res Rep, was the third one, who was the last. So, but there are a number of Japanese people who are qualified to be resident coordinator, because to become resident coordinator, you have to pass the assessment. And certainly it's not just limited to 3, but not so many people, to my understanding. Ambassador Yanagisawa, so great to see you after some years, not too many years, since our engagement in the encounter on Central Asia. Yeah, that's a very good question. Your question was about, it looks like the host country government is a little confused about the delinking exercise. I mean, first and foremost, it shouldn't be, because they are also represented. They decided in New York about the delinking, but this is the reality. One thing happens in New York and another thing reality dictates on the ground. So, and the level of understanding depends on the country, I think. Some countries are extremely well informed, others are much less informed. In some other countries, they may even have a position in favor of, or maybe against that kind of delinking, because the member states have different sort of nuanced position on these decisions. But in principle, what I did when it was dealing, and I chose, like Mikiko-san, to be the first generation of the independent resident coordinator. Yes, we just have to approach the host government and explain what the reform has been and what it means to be an independent resident coordinator, and how we work with the UNDP resident representative, ideally together with UNDP resident representative, because then we speak in single language. So, I mean, explaining how the institutional change has taken place is very important. At the same time, I think it's really important to just increase the level of engagement of the host country counterparts in a lot of things we do, be it steering committee of the UNDAF, the new UNSDCF, if you may want to call it that, or like Mikiko-san said, on a joint program, an excellent initiative. We had one too, a regional program on Spotlight in Central Asia that we managed, because then sometimes it's very it's easier for them, the governments, to understand, to see the real case happening on the ground, unfolding in front of you, rather than reading, you know, how to the manual of the United Nations, how it should work, chapter 1, chapter 2. So really, I think we tried persistently, consistently to do the two things, that regularly we inform the government, and at the same time, we involve the government in operational activities we do, but also to propose joint events that previously may not have happened jointly, like the steering committee of the UN's program, like the UN Day celebration, like our common approach to roll out SDGs. The moment we do that, I think the government starts appreciating this. So maybe, I hope this clarifies.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Shimomura and Tanaka-san. Okay, we have several speakers, but I would like to ask Professor Ambassador Takahiro Shinyo. He was a Japanese ambassador to the United Nations, and he now is a key person in Japan. Please, Ambassador Shinyo.
Thank you very much, Professor Hasegawa, and thank you very much, all of the speakers. I listened to you very carefully, and it was very thoughtful. And but I would like to ask all of you, all the presentators, and also the participants, how do you think about the followings? According to my impression, that the United Nations Charter does not write anything about the democracy, nor the SDGs mentioning the democracy. They're mentioning a little bit about the, you know, the, what should I say, the non-segregation or gender equality and so on and so forth. But I think the democracy is not something that the United Nations is striving forward. And so I wonder what you think about as a regional representative of the UN agencies in developing countries. Do you think that doing something about the democracy to be promoted as UN representatives or not? This is my first question, and the second question is that the main purpose of the United Nations, as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, Article 1 and Paragraph 3, is to promote the fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms. Fundamental freedoms and human rights. So the United Nations is the organization to promote those two things. But when I watch the activities of the United Nations, the human rights issues or fundamental freedom issues has not been well discussed enough in the UN. When we talk about the Human Rights Council, I think it is not really truly the place where the fundamental human rights or fundamental freedoms are going to be discussed, because there are many numbers of the non-democratic countries or the free countries. Rather, I think we have a majority of the non-democratic, non-freedom countries. So I think this is a huge contradiction for this huge organization. So number 2 point is the words about the human rights and fundamental freedoms. I understand that the Mr. Guterres announced that he will be holding the World Social Summit in 2025, and he might have stressed the importance of the human rights. So I think it is in the right direction in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. But it gives me an impression, the most important thing, fundamental freedom, human rights, are somehow neglected in the SDGs or in the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. So I would like to ask you, as practitioners, how do you think about this? Okay, well, thank you very much. That's all.
Professor Shinyo, thank you for the two very fundamental questions. Can you think how to respond to that? When I ask, okay, Kaneko-san, please, if you like to ask any questions, could you make it
Yes.
also to 3 minutes?
Yeah, thank you very much for very comprehensive presentation and input. I'm Yumiko Kaneko from UNDP Philippines, managing a project on DDR and peacekeeping operations in Mindanao. So my question is about multilateralism. So yes, multilateralism is indispensable to deal with global issues. However, at the global level, even the Security Council, it is quite difficult to reach consensus. On the other hand, at the country level, some donors don't prefer joint funding projects, but prefer bilateral support, including Japan. Partly because donors, a single donor is more visible, and also partly because each donor interest and priority are different.
Excellent.
So in this context, how would the UN take a lead role in facilitating multilateralism, or would there be alternatives to address global issues? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, Ikeda-san, could you make it short also? Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Good evening. My name is Akiko Ikeda from, I'm participating from Cairo, Egypt. Even though my background is San Francisco, I'm joining you from Cairo. I have a comment on Shimomura-san regarding UNRC. I live in Cairo and I participate in the UN dialogue, interagency dialogue called OMT, Operational Management Team, and have some comments regarding UNRC's functions. From HR perspective, 6 or 7 out of 10 new RCs, they are from UNDP. So reps from IOM, the REFP FAO, for which I work for, the reps from these organizations are very few. Majority come from UNDP. I want the RC background of the RCs to be more diversified, because the current UNRC in Egypt, she has also extensive number of years of UNDP experience. So when I observe her management style, I feel that the UNDP's element is very strong. We are moving towards, we talked about the UNSG's reform, and from a management perspective, we're implementing the UNSG's efficiency agenda, so-called business operation strategy, BOS, on the ground right now. Egypt has cleared the BOS implementation along with other Arab and North African countries. We need to see more UNRC engagement, but she unfortunately doesn't participate. So that's one of the weak points. And also, as you may have known, Egypt here in Cairo is a very ancient, it's a very humongous city. We cannot sustain population, growing population anymore. So our government is moving to a new administrative Cairo in the middle of desert, 2 hours from downtown Cairo, right? So that's why we're relocating. Putting every UN agency together in one UN common premise. This is also part of UNSG's common efficiency agenda. But even so, right now our relocation to the new Cairo is very crucial. But so we need a lot of RC's engagement in this relocation. But so far we haven't seen a lot of her engagement. So there is a little bit of discontent happening here. Just a short observation from the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we can now, can you respond to that, including Ine-san, if you wish? I think the first 2 points made by Ambassador Shinyo is very pertinent. What is your views on that? The first one is, in fact, the democracy is not mentioned in the charter. and not even discussed, fundamental freedom and human rights nowadays. It is declining. How is it on the ground? Because there's a lot of debate among peace building scholars that liberal democracy building is dead. What is your views on based on the ground? Tanaka-san, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll try. So yeah, looking at the world, you kind of get pessimistic sometimes, but I'll just share from a Guyana perspective of what I experienced. Well, we had 2 years of political crisis, electoral and political crisis. So democracy or democratic principles, electoral procedures, that was very central to what the UN was standing for. UNDP was trying to give electoral assistance, but the political environment was unfortunately very, very negative generally around democracy. So it didn't work out. But nonetheless, there was this I think coalition of the development partners, UNDP, UN was also involved in that to really stand for those principles of democracy. In that also the human rights side too, because Guyana also has this ethnic dimension in its politics, and there have been electoral violence in the history. So, human rights, and peaceful elections, that was really central also to the advocacy from the development community. And here, I mean, personally as an RC, I was actually convening the development partners around this whole political electoral crisis. So we didn't have the UN did not have a program per se, but, and I was liaising with DPPA, this is the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in New York, and also OHCHR to also, pass on messages. So in that sense, I mean, my own personal experience is that was very, very strong. Yeah, I had some comments on this last question too, but should I leave it?
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to it.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. Okay, Shimomura-san, would you like to address this issue or two other issues that the Kaneko-san and the Ikeda-san raised? I'm interested in your views on what the Ikeda-san is saying, that look, UNDP is now you are dancing, and if you are reserve, you are happy, but not much impact on other UN agencies, if I exaggerate the point made by Ikeda-san. What is your views on the ground?
Okay, let me start with that one. As of now, if I remember the statistics, I think UNDP people occupy about 60% of all the RC positions. And I know that SG and DSG wants also to increase non-UNDP RC increasingly. This actually makes it a little more challenging these days for UNDP people to stay as resident coordinators. So this is an interesting dynamics, the other side of the dynamics to see. I know that also the HQ is also trying to increase RCs who were not from the UN. So they're trying to raise it informally, I think 5 to 10% of the resident coordinators. And a lot, I must say, I think depends on the personality of the resident coordinator. In my case, for instance, I was quite excited about this business operations strategy, and I myself actually worked. It was one of my 3 big things that I did in Kazakhstan to launch the UN common premises in Almaty. So it really depends on who it is. But the best thing I think is really to have a candid dialogue discussion with your resident coordinator, Ikeda-san. But on the origin distribution of RCs across different agencies, this is something that Development Coordination Office in New York is attentively following. I just wanted to also touch on Ambassador Shinyo's point. Just wanted to say that at the country level, or let's say we, I think in the UN system side, we approach the human rights democracy by smartly using different roles and mandate of our functions. Resident coordinator, as resident coordinator, I have advocated for promotion of human rights, but when there are human rights violation cases, then I'm not going to go out public and criticize the government. I would actually meet with a foreign minister who does not want negative image to come be associated with the country. So foreign affairs minister tends to be friends. And that's where you actually have that sensitive discussion on cases. And agencies, as you know, some are normative mandate.
Just on that thing, Shimomura-san, can't the resident coordinator go beyond the foreign minister? And in fact, in Indonesia, it's a security apparatus and other justice ministers and so forth. Does RC have access to beyond foreign minister?
Mr. Hasegawa, this depends on the country. Here in Indonesia, credential of the resident coordinator is submitted to foreign minister, same as UNDP resident representative. Whereas in Kazakhstan, resident coordinator, that's me, I submitted my credential to the president. So I had access to security apparatus of the president, whereas other agencies submit their credentials to the foreign ministry or other line ministries. So that actually changes the access fundamentally. And in some countries, I think it does make resident coordinators' life more difficult. But yes.
Okay, thanks. I know you have many other points, but to move on, if can Yuge-san like to say any point here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can say a few things, although most of the questions were addressed to the field level activities. On Ambassador Shinyo's second point on fundamental freedoms and human rights, yes, it is true that this subject is not mentioned by itself as a separate SDG goal, or it's not as explicit as it should be in the SDGs. If you look at all the targets and then the sub-items, of course, softly and implicitly, it's embedded in terms of gender equality and things like that. I mean, without really mentioning as clearly the word human rights, but then it's everywhere, but then it's not really as specific, and it's too soft. And then I gather that the final text of this the UN document, the resolution that approved the agenda, 2030 agenda and the SDGs, of course, it's a negotiation among the member states. And what I heard is that there are many words and phrases that were there, but at the end, before reaching the consensus and being approved, they were dropped in terms of whatever that was considered not desirable or too sensitive by some member states. So of course I wanted to see much more prominently human rights coming, and then even in this our common agenda, human rights is there, but then it's there, but maybe it's not as clearly presented as some of the other items. So this is what my take of the human rights. And then it's true also, in terms of Human Rights Council and so on, this is actually the difficulty and the dilemma in the multilateralism, which actually gets into the question by Ms. Kaneko. In terms of the multilateralism, how would UN take the lead in multilateralism? I would say, one is at the global level and the other one is at the national level, and the approach to multilateralism at two different levels is different. I mean, you were mentioning about some examples in the field, and of course that has to be dealt with more at the field level, but of course with the headquarters of some of those donor agencies and the bilateral agencies that, you referred to. At the global level, of course, the responsibility is much more in terms of the UN, and then it's the agencies. Here, it's really, diplomacy, peer pressure, grouping, coalition by member states. And then if you look at the SDGs, then that was agreed. Okay, the Paris Agreement, it took so many rounds, but finally it was agreed. But then, of course, then we have to go to the next step. So, so I just wanted to mention that. I know, okay, there are only 5 seconds. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Tell me, you two people from the field, the government of China says, and refers to the UNDP Human Development Report on human rights. that human rights consist of 7 freedoms, and that as a hierarchy, and we have to really help the people to maintain their freedom from hunger and the freedom from fear from coronavirus. Before we talk about freedom of expression and associations, what do you say in your own country if the Chinese ambassadors claim that the right sequence is this? How would you respond to that question as a UN representative? Shimomura-san or Tanaka-san, what do you think? How do you respond to that the Chinese ambassador's claim that we should address the most important freedom from fear and poverty, rather than freedom for expression and association? Okay, you can think about it.
I'll
Yeah.
just jump in again. I think the country context, really defines things, right? And I was just going to say that, like in Guyana's case, smaller countries, they need that multilateralism to actually, and like in Guyana's case, they would usually come together in the Caribbean. There are 14 member states there to actually, advocate for positions. So they are a strong proponent for multilateralism. So in that environment, it's a bit different from, these bigger states. On that more trickier question, I think the angle we often use on the ground is leave no one behind, because that really, encompasses the whole, aspect of all, human rights, right? Anti-discrimination. And the other part that I think we do use as a UN country team is the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council. And if you have a government, in the case of Guyana, we did have a government that was actually interested in that. We did actually had entry points of addressing human rights from that more structural perspective. So again, maybe I was a bit luckier, but nonetheless, I mean, it doesn't mean that you can solve all the human rights problems and raise it. Like, Shimomura-san said, we have to be very sensitive and, let agencies do their part as well with regards to different kinds of population groups, children or women or whatever, but there are entry points.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, I think we will just extend about 15 minutes or so, and we have 3 people who will make a comments or questions, and we will have a response and wrap up. So Mr. Ken Inoue, the Vice President of Global Peace Building Association of Japan.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to meet all of you, particularly Mikiko-san. I left Timor-Leste almost 9 years ago. You don't change at all. I'm quite happy also for all other presenter. I have a little bit question from the different angle, maybe related to what Hasegawa-san said. Since I came back to Japan, I'm in Tokyo, but I hardly hear multilateralism and the UN in Japan. What I hear is always bilateral issues. For example, famous, like FOIPO, free and open Indo-Pacific Oceans, or Quad, or recently AUKUS. That means main focus is really China-US relationship, and Japan is also involved in these matters. So my question is, in your countries, is China is really influencing to the UN program or your countries? That is my question. And in my case, for example, 2 years ago, before the coronavirus pandemic, I went to New York and I met some PKO peoples, and they said definitely China tried to influence to the PKO operations. They cannot change their mandate, but for example, human rights officers or gender affairs officers, Chinese people, Chinese government said, there is no need to put such a high amount of the budget, just decrease it. They cannot eliminate the mandate, but they try to reduce the budget. So do you experience something similar? That means, Chinese government is influencing in the area of human rights and all these kind of related, issues? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken-san. Excellent. Fumiko Akoyama-san, please. Yeah.
Yes. I was really pleased and also surprised to hear the reports on the UN resident coordinator by Mr. Shimomura and Mrs. Tanaka, because more than 20 years ago, I was working with UNICEF in Mauritania, and it was just at that time this new system was introduced. And I remember still, so it gave really a lot of confusion to all the new UN agencies working out in Mauritania. For the government, it is more welcomed because like that, they have only one interrogator. But for the UN agencies, we have the more or less have the conflicts among us. Yes, and I heard that it was not only the Mauritania, but also in many other countries, it was the same situation. So I was surprised that after that, it's 20 years, more than 20 years had passed, and it is just now. So this system is still working, or they sort of they introduced officially. Yeah. So during these 20 years, what sort of discussions or the orientations was discussed in the United Nations? So this is what I was wondering. So if you can give me some answer about this, I will be happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now Mr. Suzuki Kenichi, he's a political secretariat of the government here. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Kenichi Suzuki. I work for a political party. The name is Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, which is the one largest opposition party. So I'm not from government side, so opposition side. At daily basis, I work with a member of parliament, so I have seen their characters. So what I want to ask today is that characteristic or quality of leader of UN organizations. Nowadays, like a big organization, like a position of head of UN organization are taken by former heads of state, like a statesman or politician. And so what is a good point and bad point of this trend, like a position taken by former heads of states? And do you think that, and also the third question is that, do you think that this trend will continue? And if that is so, why do you think that this kind of trend will continue? So this is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suzuki. I think now, because of shortage of time, I think each speaker is given 2 minutes each respond to and to make their final comments. Maybe we can start with Ms. Yuge, Professor Yuge. 2 minutes you have.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Since the most of the questions were addressed to the field level, I will respond to that last question by Mr. Suzuki, right, about the UN heads. Yeah, it is true that these days the position of UN heads are taken by former heads of states. It wasn't like this many years ago, but then now it's been more the trend. Will this continue? well, perhaps yes, as long as they're candidates. But then also when you say the good points and the bad points, I would say it really depends on that particular person and the qualification. Some former heads of states have the qualification to lead that particular agency because of the mandate of that particular agency, as well as the experience of that person. Some heads of states will be awful and then not really qualified in terms of, not having just a title, which I guess it's a qualification, but in terms of the experience, the knowledge, the personality, the leadership, and so on. So I don't think we can say that then heads of states are good candidates. Not in many countries, the heads of states will make a good candidate. So again, it's really the qualification and the personality and the background of that person. And then the trend may continue because then there may be more candidates, who are former heads of state. So it really depends on who puts up their hand, or who are the people that the member states nominate. And I think the qualification has been upped, a bit, like former ministers and then former heads of state. But I think it should not be, the case. Those can come, former heads of state, former ministers, but also other qualified candidates like the UN, career people can be. So I think I probably reached my 2 minutes. Thank you.
No, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Professor Yuge. I'll come to that, yeah. Okay, Mr. Well, we go backward. How about Takase-san? You have any comments?
I actually do not have much comment for the last three questions. Actually, for the last question, yes, I agree with Yuge-san that it really depends on the person. I don't really see it's making a trend now yet, but anyway, I think it depends on the quality of the person. But I want to go back a little bit for the Mr. Shinyo's, Professor Shinyo's question about the SDGs and human rights. SDGs are considered to be rights-based approach. And if you go to the Human Rights Council's website, they have made the analysis on how each SDG have addressing those human rights issues. And I think in our common agenda, also there's some reference on how SDGs are reflecting human rights. But perhaps because of the negotiation, the very word of human rights are not probably seen in the document of the Transforming Our World. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so we have now Tanaka-san and Shimomura-san, please. Tanaka-san, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'll address two. One is this, the RC role confusing, what's the history and whatever. Look, I think that's, and I think it touches on the human rights thing too, because, when we did the common country analysis, which is, the first part of the new UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, the new UNDAF, and it's a much more robust analysis now. There's a whole outline that is new. It focuses on who's left behind. And we have now much stronger analytical capacity in the RC office. And if you pull in some of the other agencies and also the economic commissions, you can get a pretty good quality analysis of the development issues. And I think, like giving the case of Guyana, I mean, it's easy. The flip side is that the development assistance that the UN and other partners have been providing for decades has not been effective, because that also contributed to the lack of progress. So, what I actually did a lot in the UN country team meetings, including in the discussions around the cooperation framework, was we really need to, take a hard look at how we have assisted the country, looking at, why people are left behind despite all the development assistance that is happening. And I think it really cuts into, human rights without necessarily talking about it as human rights, per se. It is about inclusion. It is about, you know, really making sure people left behind don't get left behind, right? So I think that was really effective in at least having that reflection. I don't know if we can deliver better as a result. I mean, that really depends on the capacities of all the agencies and our capacity to get the government and other stakeholders on board. One last point on China. I mean, in terms of Guyana, I think their interest was really in the economic and natural resources front. I don't think the UN was really significant in that, but they did participate in the development coordination meetings that I convened and also contributed. So, you know, I mean, you know, they're not really like-minded like some of the other partners that we tend to cooperate with, but they were part. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Shimomura-san.
Sure. On China, yes, they are increasingly willing to participate in the multilateral platform at the country level, but not necessarily active participant. They also do very good SDG related work in China, like companies are issuing SDG bonds with UNDP's assistance to create SDG taxonomies, how to use those money in the company. And Indonesia we are even learning from Chinese experience in that sense. I've noted lately that Chinese are also increasing their JPOs, junior professionals. So that may be some tactics to increase the UN population from China, which I think Japan also has done. On the UN UNDAF and the history of UN reform, yeah, I remember 2 decades plus UNDAF was introduced, and the middle of 2008, I think there was a reform to create official one UN pilot. And through that exercise, we developed a standard templates for one program across the UN agencies, one budget across the agencies, one leader concept, that's the resident coordinator, one office, and a lot of new things came out through that experiment, which are mainstream across all the countries by now. So again, it's changed progressive incrementally, but if you compare what it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago with what we have today, you'll be surprised with the progresses we made. But again, it's not perfect and we are not satisfied with what we are today. So we want to be even better. I think that's the spirit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think your input and your expression of your views are much appreciated. I think today what we learned most is that achievement of SDG requires, as Mr. Akashi said at the outset, not only the government, but the business and the other civil society organizations. And this point was elaborated by Professor Akiko Yuge, who highlighted the need for multilateral cooperation to address global issues that require more inclusive, networked, effective, equitable, and representative way of engagement. And I think Ambassador Shinyo Yanagisawa, Inoue-san and Kaneko-san, Ikeda-san as well as Hatoyama-san, and also Mr. Kenichi Suzuki of Rikken Minshito has made a very valuable comments, and I appreciate it very much. In conclusion, I'd like to make just 2 points. The one is that the Secretary General's report written in June of this year and submitted to the General Assembly for debate this month and the next month, stated the need for continued push for enhancement of resident coordinators' leadership to convene and coordinate the activities of UN agencies. But this challenge is formidable, as also stated by a number of speakers here today. I think these challenges in a final analysis is the change in the mindset, as Yuge Sensei stated, as well as change in the mentality and attitude, as Tanaka-san and Shimomura-san are rightly explained. I think these are the ultimate goal of UN resident coordinators' role in their own countries. Now, second point I'd like to make is an alarming one. Mr. Shimomura and Tanaka-san told me that you are the almost last resident coordinators, and there will be no more UN resident coordinators. This is indeed very alarming. I think we need to have more qualified people, personnel engaged in UN at the higher level. And here, I'd like to ask Daria to share with us a photo of the Commission on the SDGs that met in the 2015. And if you see it, the photo is blurred. As you remember, this commission was chaired by three: David Cameron of United Kingdom, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono of Indonesia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia. And you see on the left side, Mr. Kan Naoto of Japan. He was present only on the first meeting, but he was too busy to attend other meetings and he was not replaced. And my former employee, who later on became the finance minister of Timor-Leste, and who is a very short lady on the right side, Emilia Pires. She, in fact, wrote the draft report of that commission. And UN Rector, Dr. David Malone, was so impressed by her energy and intelligence that he invited her to come to UN University, to Tokyo, and make a presentation on SDGs. I think we should know more in what has happened. And as suggested by Mr. Akashi, I will be asking Ambassador Minami, who has written an excellent book on how the SDGs were formulated. So this relates to my final comment. That is how Japan can, in fact, bring back some sort of presence in the UN system. I think we are going down. And I'm very pleased to announce that at the initiative of Mr. Akashi and Ambassador Shinjo, we are establishing an advisory panel on enhancement or building better Japanese presence in the UN system. And we are starting the deliberation perhaps next week or thereafter. And we will approach to you for your views, suggestions, and the proposals. What I'm afraid of is that, as Mr. Ken Inoue mentioned, that the government is losing, or if not has lost appetite for engaging in UN system in a constructive, in a very substantive way. This we need to reverse it. And I like to congratulate and I like to thank you for your valuable comments that you made today. So Daria, may I now turn over to you.
Thank you, Professor Hasegawa. Apologies to everyone for going over the time, but we really cannot resist this very incisive and thought-provoking discussion. Again, thank you to our panelists for taking the time and for sharing your insights and expertise with us. And thank you to everyone for your questions and participation. Finally, I'd like to invite one of the vice presidents of GPAJ, Professor Naoko Kumagai, for event announcements and to formally close this seminar.
Thank you very much, Dalia Sensei. This is Naoko Kumagai from GPAJ. Now I'd like to announce three forthcoming events of the GPAJ. Here, as you can see on the screen, we have three upcoming events. One is next week, next Saturday, on October 9th from 8 p.m. Japan Standard Time. The title is What is Human Security of New Generation? This is Japanese only session, and we have the speaker, Professor Toshiya Hoshino, and then we have panelists, Professor Aiki Harahunt from the University of Tokyo, and me, myself, as panelists, as a discussant. And secondly, we have another session on Saturday, October 23rd, the same for time slot, 8 p.m. Japan Standard Time to 9:30. And the title of this event is A Paradox of Peace, Democracy, and Poverty, the Case of Malawi. And this is English, this is English only. And we have the honor to invite Ambassador Kai Yanagisawa. She was the former ambassador to Malawi and the former vice president of JICA. And lastly, I'd like to announce our Tokyo Peace Building Forum, which will be on Saturday, November 13th, from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Japan Standard Time. But all sessions will be held in English. This year's theme is Peace Building and Democratic Governance in an Era of Uncertainty. And we have three big panels. The first one is started with keynote speech by Ambassador Moto Noguchi. And this session is titled as The Importance of Solid Governance Structure for Peace Building and Democratic Governance. And we have panels for this panel, Ambassador Hans Klem and Dr. Veselin Polsky. And second panel, which is after the lunch break, starting at 1 p.m. Japan Standard Time. This session is titled as Development and Governance in Peace Building, Role of Diverse Actors. This session is organized by Professor Kihara Hunt, and we have four presenters. Mr. Koji Sakane, Chief Representative of JICA Sudan Office, and the second presenter, Dr. Shukuko Koyama. She is Associate Professor at Toyo University. And we have third presenter, Mr. Raymond Andaya. He is a PhD student at the University of Tokyo. And the fourth presenter is Dr. Mary Donna Ballesteros. She is full-time lecturer at Aichi Shukutoku University. And lastly, the last panel is session 3, Introduction of the G7 Plus Association of Post-Conflict and Conflict-Prone Countries and what the international community can do for Afghanistan and Myanmar. And we invite keynote speaker, Mr. Shanana Gusmao, the first president of East Timor, and we plan to invite three commentators, Ambassador Tadamichi Yamamoto, and Ms. Christine Bergner, and also ambassador of the G7 plus countries. So please save the dates for these events and then please join us. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Right. Thank you, Professor Kumagai. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you all in our future events. Until then, stay safe and healthy and have a good evening.